Imagine a city unraveling in slow motion. Banks close first, not all at once, just enough to create doubt. Lines begin forming outside branches that used to feel permanent. People whisper at first, then talk openly. Withdrawals get limited, transfers delayed. The system starts tightening. Within weeks, everything changes. Savings evaporate, businesses stall, prices jump in ways that don't make sense. Families who spent decades building stability suddenly find themselves starting over. And then there's this one family, a merchant family, not particularly famous, not politically connected. They don't make headlines. From the outside, they look just like everyone else. Same streets, same markets, same uncertainty. But something about them is different. While others scramble to access their own money, this family continues operating. They still pay suppliers, still import goods, still function, almost as if the crisis hasn't reached them yet. Pause for a second. Because they didn't predict the collapse perfectly. They didn't sell everything at the top. They didn't buy some miracle asset that outperformed everything else. Their advantage was simpler than that. Their money wasn't here. Not physically, but legally. Their accounts, their contracts, their reserves existed under a different set of rules, a different system, one that hadn't changed overnight. So while one legal environment was rewriting the terms of ownership, theirs stayed intact. And that's the uncomfortable realization. In a crisis, wealth doesn't just depend on what you own, it depends on where it exists. Because in the end, your money isn't just a number, it lives somewhere, and that somewhere can determine whether it survives or disappears. To understand why that family made it through while others didn't, you have to shift how you think about wealth. Most people see wealth as assets, cash, stocks, property, maybe gold. The assumption is straightforward. Pick the right assets, diversify enough, and you'll be protected. But that framework misses something more fundamental. Wealth isn't just financial, it's legal. Every asset you own exists inside a system of rules. Your bank balance isn't just money, it's a legal claim. Your house isn't just bricks and land, it's a title enforced by a government. Your investments only have value because a legal framework recognizes your ownership and guarantees your ability to access or transfer them. And those rules, the ones most people never think about, are not fixed. They can change, especially under pressure. When a government faces a serious crisis, whether it's debt, currency instability, or social unrest, it doesn't have many tools that work quickly. It can't create real productivity overnight. It can't instantly fix structural imbalances. But it can change the rules people operate under. It can limit withdrawals. It can freeze accounts. It can restrict transfers across borders. It can devalue the currency or redefine what that currency is worth. And it can do all of this faster than any market can react. From the outside, this feels like something extraordinary, but from the system's perspective, it's often framed as necessary. Stability comes first. Preservation of the system comes before preservation of individual wealth. So measures that would seem unthinkable in normal conditions suddenly become justified. Now pause for a second, because this is where the idea of safe investing starts to break down. You can own what looks like the safest portfolio imaginable, but if every piece of it exists within the same legal environment, it shares the same underlying risk. Not market risk, legal risk. And legal risk behaves very differently. Markets move gradually. Prices rise and fall. There's time to react, adjust, hedge. But legal changes don't give you that luxury. They're often abrupt. One day your account functions normally. The next day it's restricted. One day your funds are liquid. The next day they're not. There's no smooth transition, just a shift in what is allowed. This is where jurisdictional arbitrage becomes less of a strategy and more of a realization. It's the understanding that your wealth doesn't just depend on what you own, but on where it is recognized. Different countries operate under different legal systems, and those systems don't all break in the same way or at the same time.
So instead of concentrating everything in one place, you spread your exposure, not just across assets, but across jurisdictions. Because if one system changes the rules, another might not. That doesn't eliminate risk. It doesn't guarantee safety. Every jurisdiction carries its own set of uncertainties, but it changes the structure of your risk. It removes the single point of failure. It gives you options, access, movement, flexibility at a moment when most people have none. And once you see wealth through that lens, the question shifts in a way that's hard to ignore. It's no longer just about what you own. It's about which legal system decides whether you still own it tomorrow.
If this still feels theoretical, history gives you a version of it that's almost too clear. Look at the system of treaty port system in China. On the surface, it was political, foreign powers carving out zones of control inside major Chinese cities. But underneath that, something more subtle was happening. These zones weren't just different geographically, they operated under entirely different legal systems, different courts, different rules of enforcement, different interpretations of ownership. And that created a split reality. Two merchants could operate on the same street, serve the same customers, sell the same goods, and yet exist under completely different frameworks of protection. One's contracts enforced locally, subject to shifting political pressure. The other's contracts enforced under foreign law, backed by external authority. Most of the time, that difference didn't feel urgent. Business was business, trade flowed, markets functioned. But when instability hit, that invisible line became everything. China during that era went through repeated waves of disruption, internal rebellions, external conflicts, financial strain, political fragmentation. In those moments, local systems didn't always hold. Property rights could be reinterpreted, debts could be renegotiated or ignored. Authority wasn't always consistent, and enforcement could weaken quickly. And that's where things diverged. Inside the concession zones, the rules didn't shift in the same way. Foreign merchants operated under systems that, while imperfect, were more stable relative to the surrounding environment. Their contracts were still recognized, their access to capital remained, their ability to move goods and settle transactions continued with less interruption. So while domestic elites faced uncertainty, sometimes losing land, assets, or entire businesses, those operating under foreign jurisdiction often maintained continuity. Not perfectly, but enough to survive. Pause for a second and think about what that implies. The difference wasn't intelligence, it wasn't timing, it wasn't even necessarily the type of asset. It was the legal environment. The same warehouse, the same inventory, the same commercial activity, completely different outcomes depending on which system governed it. And this is where the idea of a single economy starts to break down. We tend to imagine countries as unified financial systems, one currency, one market, one set of rules. But in reality, those systems can fragment, sometimes quietly, sometimes suddenly. Legal boundaries can create parallel realities within the same physical space. And most of the time, you don't notice them until something breaks. Because when pressure builds, economic, political, financial, governments start making changes, sometimes gradual, sometimes abrupt. And those changes don't apply equally across all jurisdictions. Some areas remain stable, others become unpredictable. And if all your assets are tied to the unstable side, you don't have options. Now, consider how this plays out at a more human level. A domestic merchant, fully embedded in the local system, might see their contracts challenged, their currency devalued, their access restricted. They're not doing anything wrong, they're just operating under a system that's changing faster than they can respond. Meanwhile, another merchant, same skills, same business, continues operating because their legal anchor is somewhere else. Their obligations, their claims, their protections are defined outside the collapsing structure. They're not immune, but they're insulated. And that distinction matters, because in a crisis, survival isn't about avoiding impact entirely, it's about avoiding total exposure. Now, to be clear, concession zones were not ideal systems. They were tied to unequal power dynamics, and they created their own distortions. But if you strip away the politics and look purely at the mechanics, the lesson is hard to ignore. When legal systems diverge,
outcomes diverge, and people who spread their exposure across those systems don't experience the same level of risk as those who remain fully concentrated in one. This pattern doesn't belong to one country or one time period. You see versions of it in collapsing empires, in revolutions, in debt crises, in any environment where the rules governing ownership start to shift. Some people are trapped inside those changes. Others, for one reason or another, are positioned outside of them. And that distinction isn't visible beforehand, but it becomes obvious afterward. Now bring that forward. We don't have visible concession zones in the same way today. There are no clearly marked districts where different flags determine legal reality on a street-by-street level. But the concept hasn't disappeared. It's just become less obvious. Different countries, different banking systems, different legal protections, different responses to crisis. The fragmentation still exists. You just don't see it until you need it. And that leads directly into the next layer of the problem, because most people don't fail to protect their wealth because they chose the wrong asset. They fail because they were never given the chance to move it in the first place.
This is where the theory stops being abstract and becomes painfully real, because most people don't actually lose their wealth in one dramatic moment. They get trapped first, and only then do they lose it. The sequence matters more than the event itself. Look at what happened during the Argentina economic crisis 2001. Before everything broke, life still looked normal on the surface. People had savings, businesses operated, the financial system still functioned, until pressure built to the point where it couldn't. And when that moment came, the response wasn't to let the system collapse freely, it was to contain it. So the exits were closed, withdrawals were limited, transfers were restricted. People could still see their bank balances, but accessing that money became a different question entirely. You didn't lose your savings overnight, not technically. The number was still there, but your ability to use it was suddenly controlled. They called it the corralito, but the name doesn't really capture the feeling. Imagine standing in front of your account, knowing the money exists, but realizing you can't move it when you need to. You can't convert it into something more stable. You can't take it out in full. You can't respond. You're effectively frozen in place while everything around you starts shifting. And then the second phase begins. The currency weakens, confidence drops further, prices begin to adjust, sometimes quickly, sometimes unevenly. But the key is this: the environment continues moving while you remain stuck. That's what turns a restriction into a loss. Because by the time value starts changing, your ability to act is already gone. Pause for a second and follow that sequence carefully. First, access is restricted. Then, value deteriorates. And when those two things overlap, the outcome is almost predetermined. You're not just exposed to the crisis, you're forced to absorb it without any flexibility. Now compare that to a smaller group of people who had something different, not necessarily more wealth, but a different structure. Some portion of their assets existed outside the domestic system. Foreign accounts, offshore entities, holdings governed by another legal framework. They weren't immune to the crisis, but they weren't fully contained by it either. They still had the ability to move capital, to transact in more stable environments, to preserve purchasing power while the local system adjusted. That difference, access versus containment, is everything. Because ownership in a crisis becomes a secondary question. The real question is whether you can actually use what you own. You can have a large balance on paper and still be functionally powerless if you can't access it when conditions change. And once you see it that way, the illusion becomes clear. Wealth that cannot move is not really wealth, it's exposure. Now zoom out, because Argentina wasn't an isolated case. Variations of this have happened across different countries in different decades. Capital controls, withdrawal limits, currency restrictions, they tend to follow the same logic, always introduced as temporary measures, always framed as necessary for stability. And sometimes they are temporary, but temporary in a crisis can last long enough to redefine outcomes. While access is restricted, life doesn't pause. Prices move. Opportunities shift, assets reprice, and the people who can't move with those changes end up absorbing the full impact of them. Meanwhile, those with even partial exposure to other jurisdictions operate under a different set of constraints, not risk-free, but not trapped. This creates two parallel realities inside the same economy. One group experiences the full force of the collapse, unable to adjust or escape. The other navigates it with options, limited, imperfect, but real.
And here's the part most people don't realize until it's too late. By the time capital controls are announced, the decision has already been made for you. The window to move has already closed. Because once a system is under enough pressure to restrict movement, it no longer allows easy exit. That's the entire point. So jurisdictional diversification isn't something you execute during a crisis. It's something that either existed before the crisis or didn't exist at all. And if it didn't, then you're not just dealing with market risk anymore. You're dealing with confinement.
Up until now, everything we've talked about sounds like it belongs to a different world. Merchant families, foreign concessions, offshore structures, things that feel distant, expensive, maybe even inaccessible. And for a long time, they were. Jurisdictional diversification used to require scale. You needed significant capital, legal connections, international access. It wasn't something the average person could realistically do. If your wealth was tied to your home country, it stayed there. But that assumption is starting to change. Not because governments suddenly became more flexible, but because geography itself is changing. In the past, location was physical. Your money lived where your bank was. Your assets existed where they were registered. Moving wealth meant physically crossing borders, opening accounts, setting up entities, navigating complex systems. Today, some of that friction is gone. Not completely, but enough to matter. You can now hold certain forms of value outside traditional banking systems. You can access financial services across borders without physically being there. You can structure parts of your financial life in ways that aren't entirely anchored to a single jurisdiction. And this creates something new, a kind of digital geography, where your assets don't just sit in one place, they exist across multiple systems, some of which are not directly controlled by your local environment. Now pause for a second, because this doesn't mean you've escaped risk. Far from it. Every system, digital or physical, comes with its own vulnerabilities. Regulations can change, access points can be restricted, technology can fail, and in some cases the risks are less visible, not less real. But the structure is different. Instead of being fully dependent on one legal framework, you introduce layers. Some assets remain local, practical, accessible, necessary for daily life. Others exist in systems that operate under different rules, different jurisdictions, different assumptions about ownership and access. And that layering matters because it creates separation, not total protection, but distance from a single point of failure. Now there's a temptation here to think of this as a complete solution. It's not. Digital systems can be restricted, cross-border access can be tightened, and not every option is suitable for everyone. Legal compliance still matters. Understanding what you're doing matters even more. But the direction is clear. The barrier that once made jurisdictional diversification exclusive is lowering. Not eliminated, but lowered enough that the concept is no longer theoretical for ordinary people. And that leads to a more grounded question. If you don't need to move everything, if you don't need millions, what does a practical version of this actually look like? So what does this look like in practice? Not in theory, not at the level of multinational corporations or ultra-wealthy families, just at an individual level. Something real, something you can actually do without turning your life upside down. First, drop the idea that this is about escaping your country. That mindset usually leads to bad decisions. This is not about abandoning one system. It's about not being fully dependent on a single one. Start small. Think in percentages, not extremes. You don't need to move everything. In fact, you shouldn't. Your local system still matters. You live in it, earn in it, spend in it. But allocating a small portion of your savings into a different jurisdiction changes your risk structure immediately. That could mean holding some funds in a foreign currency account. It could mean owning a physical asset stored in another country. It could mean using financial platforms that operate under different legal frameworks. The exact method matters less than the principle. Separation. Then think about income. If all your income is tied to one economy, you're fully exposed to it. But even a small secondary stream, remote, cross-border, or independent of your local system, creates flexibility.
It gives you a way to interact with other jurisdictions without needing to relocate. And here's the key. Everything should be done legally, transparently, and gradually. This isn't about hiding, it's about structuring. Because the goal isn't to avoid rules, it's to be subject to only one set of rules. So the protocol is simple. A small percentage of savings outside your primary jurisdiction, at least one channel of income that isn't fully local, and awareness of where your assets actually live in legal terms. Not dramatic, not complicated, but enough to create distance. Because in the end, your wealth isn't just what you own, it's the system that defines whether you still own it tomorrow.